Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another session of the Universe Rights. As you all already know, we have with us today Mr. Ashok Ferrey, who is the author of 6 books now, including Code for the People, which remains the top-selling English book in Sri Lanka till date. His latest book is The Unmanageable Man, which is just released. If you haven't got yourselves a copy yet, please pick it up. You are not going to regret it. Ashok is also a guest lecturer at the Colombo School of Architecture, and he also hosts his own TV show, The Ashok Ferrey Show. In conversation with Ashok is one of India's best-selling and critically acclaimed writers, Anita Nair. Anita is the author of several books and poetry collections, including Eating Wasps and a crime series featuring Inspector Gowda. She also wrote the screenplay for the movie adaptation of her novel, Lessons in Forgetting, which won the National Film Award in 2013. And Anita's books have been translated into over 30 languages around the world. Wow, that's amazing. Without taking any more of your time, over to you guys, Anita, Ashok. Thank you so much.
Okay, good evening, Ashok. It's so wonderful to be able to talk to you about your new book, especially because, in my mind, I see several of these things unfolding, knowing your interest in building and having met some of your family and so on. I think that I'm constantly trying to think, do I know this person? Do I know that person? Do I recognize this? And so on. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about the book? Okay, for those of you who haven't seen it, here is the book. And it's a delightful read. So please pick up your copies if you haven't already.
Anita, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this session. This was in many ways the most difficult book I ever had to write, and in many ways the easiest. It was easy because I was drawing almost entirely from personal experiences. However, it's very dangerous drawing from personal experiences because there's a tendency not to leave that distance between you and your work, which is essential for it not to be too self-indulgent or for it to be a misery memoir. For instance, I'll give you an example. The father in this book is quite a monster. And in real life, my father was the loveliest, gentlest person imaginable. So there is a danger in reading too much into the script that it's for real. On the other hand, what it deals with, my grief at my father's death and then subsequently my mother's, that is very real. So I used these other experiences to bring out the quality of that grief or what it meant to me. So very easy on the one hand because the stuff was already there, very difficult to try and keep that distance and try and not to indulge too much.
Yeah, in fact, I was just thinking when you said misery memoir, that this book could have become that, but it wasn't that. So it has a very lightness of touch, which you see, which allows you to, which actually emphasizes the grief more than if you had written about it in a maudlin tone. And so I think that is where the success of the book lies, of this young man who has, who's had a certain kind of life, and suddenly he decides to remove himself from that place. And he is actually recreating himself entirely, Sanjay, this character. And back of my mind, I kept thinking, so is this a coming of age novel? In a strange way it is, but also it's not, because you see that the character is talking about it 30 years behind. I mean, he's living 30 years ahead of time, and this book is narrated in the 80s of England. So Mrs. Thatcher's regime, I think I should use the word. And so tell us a bit more about why you chose to set this in the 80s in London.
Anita, I was there at the time. I just finished Oxford and I didn't have a visa to stay on in England. So I ended up in the building game, as one always does in London, because in the 80s was so special. there was such a boom in real estate that you could literally walk from one building site to another and get a job. Just walk in and get a job. And if you didn't like the pay at the end of the day, you could walk to the next one, which would have been only another 100 yards on. There was a massive boom. And I think I was sort of lucky or whatever that I was in this area called Brixton, which is a very black area, for want of a better word. It's where there were lots of very prosperous West Indians who were then selling up their houses and moving on. And there was a lot of work going on in these old houses. So me, as an Asian, I was something of an oddity, because in those days, in 1980, there was no Asian ever working on a building site. They would work in shops, they'd work in gas stations, they'd work anywhere, restaurants, but certainly not in the building game, which was considered even lower. So there was I, mixing sand and cement, mixing concrete in the freezing cold, and kind of leading this cloak and dagger life. I never let on that I had a maths degree from Oxford or whatever, because I would have been driven out of that building site. I would have been sacked straight away. They would have thought I was too uppity for them or whatever. So anyway, I thought to myself, this is an era which is so special in England. Even today, people talk about the Thatcher 80s, but more seeing it from the bottom up, seeing it as a member of the underclass, and seeing it particularly as an Asian in the underclass, which is very rare because Asians were more prosperous in general than this builder's laborer. So that's why I said it then.
Yeah, and so Sanjay is, like he says in the book, the only probably South Asian builder or Asian builder. So were you also one of the, or were you the only Asian builder, you think, at that point? Probably.
Do you know, I was, to my knowledge, I was in 1980. I certainly didn't come across any other in South London. And the boom was just beginning in 1980. By the time I cashed in my chips and left in 1988, it was at its peak. It peaked a month after I left in August. And then, of course, it crashed that December. So I was very, very lucky. Or there is somebody up there manipulating all this and pulling strings, because it certainly was through no skill of my own that I cashed in just at the right time, but I just did. I'd made up my mind, you see, that at the age of 30, I was going to come home to Sri Lanka. Whether I'd made it or whether I'd not made it, it didn't matter. 30 was my deadline. But what happened was 30 came and went. 30, I turned 30 in 1987 in September. So I still had this 1 year left, because stickler for these kind of, for the rules of the law, I thought I'm still 30 till the 1st of September 1988. So I left in July 88. And in August, the market peaked. By December, it had crashed. So sometimes it pays to be a bit kind of foolish and stick to your guns. And I don't know.
Oh, wow, that is scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was also thinking that in many ways, the house that Sanjay actually, starts work on, the first house, Tintern, is that how you say it?
Tintern Street.
Yeah, Tintern Street. And it seemed to me that the house was a metaphor for Sanjay's life, in that sense, that there was so much of it that was all right on the outside, but falling apart inside. And Sanjay has to rebuild all of it, not recreate, but rebuild it. He has to salvage what could be salvaged, and he has to decide what to keep and what to throw. And that to me seemed like a great metaphor which is why I said it was in some ways like a coming of age novel, because you see how Sanjay emerges from this young man, pretty intimidated by his father and his satellites of love, as you call them, which is a wonderful phrase. And then this house. And so what made you think of, I know builder, house, all of that, but obviously, when you go back and you look and you realize, did the character happen first, or did the metaphor happen first?
Gosh, that's a very good question. And you're the first person who's kind of joined up the dots here. Because actually, it is a coming of age novel, because although he was 19 or whatever, which is old enough by Western standards, his mental age when his father died was more like about 14 or 15. As he says, he never had a girlfriend. He couldn't actually bring one home because his father would make fun of it. And so he just lived the life almost of a prisoner at home. It was a lovely prison. He enjoyed it. He loved his captor, as he calls him.
He says,
but at the same time, he was trapped in the headlamps of his captor's sarcasm, as he says at one point. Anyway, fast forward, he goes to London, and his friends there, the people he knows, Myrna's son, says, well, why don't you get in touch with your English cousins? You have English cousins here. And he, at every point of the novel, he refuses to, because he doesn't want any taint of his past life. He wants to reinvent himself. And as you quite rightly say, the house is the reinvention, because he takes his old house and turns it into two brand new units. And the very first day that his friend, the carpenter, takes the staircase banisters off, he wanders around that evening and he says that the new shapes that were created by the carpenter were messing with the mathematics of his mind. And they were far better than any hallucinatory drug, which for me still today holds true. I go into a house and the shapes of it, I'm sure you're the same, Anita, being a fellow builder here. You know, that's the one thing we really have in common. You know, you go in and the volumes do something to your mind. They really mess with your mind, because beautiful volumes speak to your mind, and bad volumes, you just want to leave. You want to go away from that room. So to get back to Sanjay, he really desperately wanted to reinvent himself. Again, and somewhere else he says, it's not being that I wanted, it's becoming. You know, he didn't want to be in that static position that everyone else saw him in. He wanted to become something else, and England in some funny way did that for him. Now, in real life, precisely the same thing happened to me in a somewhat different way. I was at boarding school there, in a Catholic boarding school. You can imagine how strict and constrictive that was. It was a beautiful, wonderful school, and I really, really had some of the finest teachers in the world in those monks who were teaching for love, not for money, and it makes such a big difference. And Oxford was a kind of a dream world, particularly, again, for a South Asian, a relatively poor Sri Lankan, to go into this very, very affluent, top drawer kind of society. However, I was still a very immature young boy. I don't know what it is, but we South Asians, I think we develop much later than other races, and particularly us men. I think women are much more developed, or they're cuter in every sense of the word. Do you know? They know what they want and they go for it, and they're not afraid to go for it. Men, I think, bumble about to their mid-20s, sometimes into their early 30s before they really know what they want. And so for me too, that building game that I stumbled into completely by accident, kind of, to use a cliche, made a man of me, because it allowed me to think for myself. And I remember going back home, may have been a year after I started, and I could see how different the home fires were and how different my parents had become. Of course, they hadn't become different. They were still the same people. But to me, they'd become different because I was a different person then.
Yeah.
And I could see that they were human beings, but they didn't have that kind of, they didn't inspire the awe that they would have as a normal Asian parent does in Asian children. You know, I could see them as human beings with their frailties, their weaknesses. And I knew in some strange way, I had stolen a march on them, because they did their best. With a maths degree from Oxford, you don't end up as a bloody builder, you know? So they did their best to persuade me to go to Harvard Business School, do this, do that. We'll introduce you to the CEO of this company. You'll have a great job in this and that. And I said, no, I want to go back to mixing my sand and cement, because I'm making money and I feel happy there.
Yeah.
And I did, and so on. Anyway, that's sort of part of the story. I won't ruin it.
Would you read a bit so that, you know, those who haven't can hear you?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm going to read a bit just after the funeral, for the selfish reason that I never get to read this in public normally. It's kind of too solemn and somber. So if you don't mind, it's only 3 minutes. I'm going to read this kind of slightly solemn piece. It's just literally, they've just come back from the funeral, the cemetery. Back home, Myrna opened up the corrugated cardboard boxes lined with newspaper containing the patties, the cutlets, the pancake rolls, and the crowd, mostly unidentified strangers, fell on them. Nothing sharpens the appetite like a good funeral, though as funerals went, this one had not been that good. No politicians in white sarongs, no lawyers in dandruff black coats shiny with grease and rapaciousness, no Boy Scouts, no plump white actress wiping away a practiced tear from a mascaraed eye. My father had not known anyone prominent or rich, had not cared to. Indeed, he had considered it the height of vulgarity for people to advertise their qualifications or flaunt their wealth, the way they did in modern Sri Lanka, where the rich would tattoo the very dollars to their forehead if they possibly could. For this coming week, we have organized a rota of people to sleep in the house with you, big fellow, the satellite said. We're taking it in turns. It's not good for you to sleep alone in a funeral house. Alone? I pointed silently at the various faux relations bedding down for the night in odd corners of the house. Sad, no doubt, that there was no liquor in the house to prolong the party. After much bickering, the satellites were persuaded to go home. I went in and closed the door to my room. Grief must be faced squarely and alone. A man in a walled garden watching the sunset. A thin line of uncertain, wavering brilliance at the top of the mellow brickwork. There for one brief moment, then gone, leaving behind only the blank page of an unreadable sky. The insignificant noises outside my room faded away, and I sat in silence, and wave after wave of grief washed over me, thin and clear and bright, like breakers on an early morning shore. His absence was so palpable, so tactile, I could reach out all around and touch it. I had hated and despised him for so much of my life. I had spent the last years barely talking to him. There had been no great rapprochement during his last days, as there is in films. He and I had been too busy fighting the bureaucracy of death, barely surviving from day to day, keeping our heads above water to think of any nobler objective. And now he was gone. I could not even reach out for the familiar comforts of hate or indifference anymore. All I had was his silence. Then, somewhere in the watches of that sleepless night, the truth came to me that grief is only the transmutation of love, of the very same chemical composition, liquid and distilled, the one inevitably turning to the other like ice to water. It had taken the half-completed life and early death of one man for me to discover this. Thank you.
Yeah, there's some passages that are very, very heartrending because you can sense the deep grief in those words. I'm sure, nobody ever gets past the laws of parents, one way or the other. Whether you are 70 years old and you lose a parent, or you're 7 years old and you lose a parent, I guess the grief is the same. It's probably just the degree of it that's moderately or mildly different. So one of the things that very much interested me about this book, and I was also thinking about the ceaseless chatter of demons, and there's this presence of occult that keeps happening, and it happened. There's this what you call this, I would think, this malicious force out there. I don't want to give it a name. You could call it demons, of course, but just a malicious force. And you see the presence in the ceaseless chatter of demons, and then you see that in this book as well. And I was wondering about that. Is it something that interests you, or is it something that just happens? You don't know where it's coming from, and you write about it.
Well, again, an interesting question, Anita, because having kind of explored the light side of demons in the Ceaseless Chatter of Demons, where the devil is actually quite a likable character, this book was not supposed to have any kind of occult in it. It just crept in yet again. However, I do have to say this, that in those 8 years, I lived and worked in those various old houses in London. And it wasn't the one in Tintern Street. Interestingly, it was in one of the others, Strathclyde Road, which I mentioned briefly later on.
The
I
house
went
that he buys after the Tintern house.
Exactly. Although in real life, that is a house I bought 8 or 10 houses on. So it wasn't the next one. And I've mixed it up because actually that's the one, and I shouldn't really say this because there's probably some very decent young people living in that house at the moment. But I remember walking in and thinking, and you buy these houses on paper, you see them once as a building site and you buy them. And it's quite a different thing to start working on them and live in them, because I used to live in these building sites in a sleeping bag. And I knew there was something not right about that house. I knew there was a malevolence there. And I would hate it when the workers left in the evening and I was alone there. And once in a while, you are aware. I mean, I call it death in the book, and there's the young guy has this kind of funny experience, but it's just a malevolence. I don't think there's anything else you can call. There's a good side to it and a bad side, and you do feel it. I don't know. Do you feel it? I mean, is this? Am I being a bit?
Definitely. You get a certain energy from the house, and either you want to be there or you want to just leave. You don't want to stay there. It bothers you are out of that place. And so right through this book, I kept thinking that the father who returns as the ghost would explain to him what it was. But then I realized that it wasn't necessary. It really wasn't. The point was that it wasn't really the point of the book. The point of the book was the restoration of Sanjay. And this is just this malevolent force that is there. But that brings me to the father. He's so much nicer as a ghost, as Sanjay himself thinks, I think. And so what made you decide, and you say that at somewhere right at the end of the book, that he saw Sanjay through 84 houses. He was his business advisor kind of on 84 houses. So the father, what did you want that particular character of the ghost to achieve? Was he just, like he says, something that he is hallucinating, or is it really a presence?
Well, yeah, again, interesting question. Do you know, I don't think I know the answer to that myself. Here again, the ghost just appeared halfway through the book. It's almost, I think, obviously the realistic or real explanation is that it was a sort of wish fulfillment on Sanjay's part to have this man back in a form that he could get on with much better. And they do get on much better, although they start, and the father is just as naughty in as a ghost as he is in real life. But the father says at one point, the ghost says, I think, Sanjay, you'll find that death has quite mellowed me. And that's, in a way, Sanjay has recreated this thing because he wants the answers that he never got in real life. And whether it's Sanjay himself supplying these answers and imagining them coming from something else, or that there was something else, is left for the reader. I kind of fancy the idea this is all in Sanjay's head, but the ghost, the new father, if you like, the new look father, is a much more rational human being, a more sane human being than the earlier real life model was. So in a way, the father helps rehabilitate Sanjay in his later life, and is actually quite happy when Sanjay hooks up with the hooker, where he never expects this sort of thing. So in many ways, I think this creature, this ghost, was nothing to do with the malevolence. He was there as a sort of buffer to the malevolence that existed in some of these houses. But he had a much more important role to play in rehabilitating this young man, putting the pieces back together again, the broken pieces of the young man.
Yeah. No, it's, I think one of the greatest triumphs of this book is how it works on so many layers and levels. It's just like, in some ways, it's like a house that's restored, and you go back and you start finding little interesting things. You from the outside, so you think it's a book. Yes, Ashok Ferrey has written it, so it's definitely going to be a good book. But then you start seeing little details and nuances and stuff like that. And that makes you kind of stop, ponder. That one of the things that comes up again and again is this phrase, the unreadable sky. He keeps using it, right at the end as well, after he doesn't go for his mother's funeral, but there's that mention there, there's an unreadable sky and so on. So what did that what was that phrase all about? Because it appears more than, at least I think, about 4 or 5 times. So
4 or 5 times. Yeah. And in fact, again, you've hit the nail on the head. It is the most important phrase in the entire book, because you could say the book is all about that. In fact, so much so that that was actually going to be the original title. Mm-hmm. And then my lovely editor and various people, including my own kids, decided that The Unmanageable Man was a much nicer, punchier, more interesting title, because The Unreadable Sky is a very generic sort of title. But that phrase meant a lot to me because, even when he's trying to explain his grief, trying to understand his grief, he looks up. And you think the answer is up there. Every time you look up, you think the answer is up there, and you can't read what the sky is telling you. It's I think, for me, it emphasizes that the kind of the mystery, the unknowability of this world. We try and understand the entirety of this world in its minutiae, in the little pieces, to try and draw a conclusion from the little pieces to the entire thing. And that is so not what the world is about, because the world is out there, and it is so unknowable. I think that's actually what I was trying to explore in this book. The unreadability of the sky. The fact is, it's there, it's all around. You try and understand the death of a father, and you look up, and the answer is there, but you just can't read it. And I think perhaps we go through our entire lives not being able to understand. Perhaps we understand it after our death. Who knows? But is that? But and thank you for bringing that out, because actually that is the most important phrase in the entire book.
No, in fact, I kept thinking, so like I said, you see, on the surface, it is, yes, a coming-of-age novel. It's funny. There's lots of funny bits in it. And there are, so many of those little things so you go through the book very quickly. It's a very quick read, because it's so easily paced, and, and the story is just moving. There's something happening all the time. There isn't too much of navel gazing, really, by the character. And so he's just doing things, and while he's doing things, he's thinking about it, and it just falls seamlessly into thought and deed pattern. And then you see all these multiple layers that emerge, like there are such deep philosophical insights into it, like the grief and love, how grief, the ice to water kind, that, the metaphor that you've used there about grief and love being of the same substance, really. And then there's so many other things. There is this relationship between the young man and the older woman. There is that whole thing about Sri Lankan society, the way they are, and the various things and so on, and all of that. So you start reading it, and then later when you sit back and you retrospect about the book, and you think, oh, there is this angle to it, and there's this layer to it. And so it's a slim book, but I think it's packed with so much, so much. It's like a baklava in that sense. Layers and layers and layers of pastry, but so seemingly light, And the other question that I had for you is, this book has come out in Sri Lanka already, like it has in India. And you had your book launch yesterday. So did you read the bits from the Sri Lankan society there?
Actually, last night was the Sri Lanka UK Society. The launch was a week prior. Okay. And so last night, You know that Sri Lanka UK society gets a bit of a bad rap early on in the book. So I had to explain that to them because all these elderly, rather serious people with lots of gravitas were going to buy the book and would be outraged when they read it. So I said, look, it's not about you, I said. It's about what happened in 1980, you know. So that is kind of different. But on the actual opening, which was, as I said, a couple of weeks back, I read... I certainly didn't read the solemn bits because Sri Lankan audiences cannot take solemnity for too long. They really can't. Trust me. We're an island race. We're in it for the good times, as I'm sure you guys in India have realized about us a long time ago. You know, it really is an island race. So to get back to this, the lightness that you were talking about earlier, one of the things I've been cursed with is the prose, which allows you to read it very quickly. And even with this book, I've had about 3 or 4 people coming up and saying, oh, I sat up all night and I read it. And I'm very tempted to say, put it down and 3 months later, read it again, you know, because it's an easy read. There might be a tendency to miss out on all the other layers. Now you caught them because you are an author yourself. So you are alive to various nuances, which a normal reader might not be alive to. So it is kind of a curse having that smooth prose. It would have been better if I'd made it clunkier so that the reader is caught short and is forced then to think about things along the way. You know, when the road is too smooth, you don't notice the scenery. You just go straight for it, straight to the end, you know, so that's kind of a bummer. But to get back to my audiences, over here, I read only the light stuff, the funny bits. Actually, this book doesn't have so many funny bits in the way that Demons has, or Serendipity is the one.
You know, the thing is, I think it's also that it's almost like it's said with a straight face. If you were imagining the characters, it's being said with a straight face. So you are like watching it and then you're laughing because you're laughing at the expense of those two. So that's what I think is so funny about it, really. It's not funny, but...
that's it. It's
very wry.
Yeah. Although I'm kind of sad also because I love slapstick and I can't help putting slapstick in. But this book has very little slapstick, you know? And that's
you see a bit of that when the father comes back as the ghost.
Yes, I think I think actually that is one of the main reasons the father had to come back, because I needed this comic ghost, you know. I needed some slapstick in there. So you're right. Yeah.
And so tell us a bit about your routine, Ashok, as a writer. You know, it's one thing that most readers and I think people who will be watching this would be interested to know that what is your writing process like?
I'm afraid that I have the lazy man's approach to writing. I'm quite lucky, as indeed you are, that we wear several hats. So we wear the builder's hat or the personal trainer's hat or the designer's hat, whatever. So when I finish a book, the last thing I think about is another book. I know there are many very, very good, fine writers who are really, truly professional, who the day they finish one book, they will start the next. I prefer to keep things in my head for as long as I can. And generally that's a couple of years. I keep it in there, mulling it. One of the reasons I think is this, because once I write something down, and I write longhand, and I think you do too, once I write it down, there is a sense of finality to it. And because I'm lazy to cross it off. I'm not ruthless enough. Whereas if I keep it in the mind edits it. So what seems like a good idea at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, a week later, I will have edited it out and thought, gosh, I certainly can't have that. That's ridiculous, you know? So by the time I'm ready to put pen to paper 2 years down the line, it is virtually fully formed. I have to say, and I know this goes against the grain of most writers' workshops and most writers, that first draft is, I think, about 80% there when I do write it down. But because it's been edited in my head, edited and re-edited and re-edited. Now, as I get older, I find it more and more difficult to keep all that in my head. So I'm beginning to have to take notes But I hate that. I mean, up till now, I never did that, because it's so much better to keep it there and let it edit itself. When you put it on paper, you do then have to start playing chess with it and move characters around on a board. And again, I don't put it on the computer till it's the third draft, because to write it on the computer is too easy. And it's like houses. If a house is easily built, it will fall down in 10 years. A house that is difficult to build with bricks and mortar and sand and cement will last much longer than a house that's thrown up with timbers and plasterboard and a quick slap of emulsion on a quick slap of plaster and emulsion. American houses are like that. I'll never forget walking through Beverly Hills, me with my little plastic bag. I think they thought I was a domestic staff. That's why they didn't shoot me. But I walked up and down many of those streets, and the houses looked beautiful. And there was one that was being remodeled, and I was aghast. It was just plywood and chicken wire, the entire thing. And coming from Sri Lanka, where houses are built of solid brick, we may be really poor, but we build solidly, do you know? And here, the richest country in the world, and possibly the richest per capita area in the States, whatever, I don't know. And these multi-million-dollar houses being built out of chicken wire, you know, it then came home to me. And there is a reason for that, because every person who buys that house, every 10 years or 5 years, the house changes hands. The new person knocks it all down and starts again. Whereas here, you build and you build forever. You build for 7 generations, not just for one. So when it's hard to build with the bricks and the mortar, it lasts much longer because you've expended so much energy on it and time. Exactly the same with writing. Because writing longhand is a laborious process, I find your mind is editing even as you write. You don't write bullshit. Whereas on a computer, it's very tempting for me to write bullshit. When I do journalism, bits of journalism, I do it straight on the computer. But when it's something serious like a book, it has to go into longhand. But does that make sense? Am I being a bit stupid?
Absolutely, because you're pretty much saying what I've been saying all along, which is that I write longhand too. And a book has to stay for a long time with me before it actually first is put down on paper itself. You know, so it's like I always think that my first drafts are also almost always complete. Pretty much what happens is rearranging them more than anything else. You know, the
absolutely.
Secret, because you have it all and you know that there's a story. You just need to make sure what is the most effective way of sequencing the thought and nothing else beyond that, really. And then, of course, all the little tweaking that you do. But in terms of characters and in terms of storyline, the first draft is almost there. Because, and I think it's also because we write longhand, you know, so it's a very deliberate action. And so there is a certain deliberate way of thinking that happens, I think, by osmosis, because you're writing in a certain way. And I don't like I don't like anything messing up the page. So I don't like crossing out anything. So it's very, very seldom that you would see like large chunks of things crossed out.
Yeah, quite right.
Or a phrase there. That's about it. Or I might just reshift it at the same page. But no, there's no that. Because, and I really think it's because you know that you have to expend all that physical energy writing it. And why would you then scratch it out?
Absolutely.
It's like, it's again, to go back to the building metaphor. You don't build a wall and tear it down. I mean, just because you don't like it. So you think before you actually build a wall, you know, so you know that is that wall essential there, and only then you put it up. So yeah, I think in many ways, because of this this great love that we have for building, I think that also has seeped into writing, or I don't know if it's vice versa.
Oh yes, the other way around. Yeah,
other way around.
Either way. Yeah.
And so what about now that you're in Colombo, do you build houses still?
Yeah, and it's quite different here, because in London, the housing stock is so huge that it's very rarely you get a chance to design and build a house from scratch. Anyway, I couldn't. I was a total amateur and I was learning on the job. So in London, it was a sort of internal rearrangement of rooms to convert a couple of flats, either 2 flats or 3 flats, out of these very vertically sort of old houses on 2 or 3 floors. If it was a 2-floored house, it became 2 apartments. If it was 3 floors, it became 3 flats. But that's quite different from what I do here. And I'd never built a house from scratch till I came back. And I draw my own blueprints. And literally in the old days, I would go to Panadura where the timber merchants were and buy a log, get it sawn, bring it back, keep it in the shade to dry and mature, and use it 3 months later. So it was an incredibly long process to build a house in Sri Lanka. It takes about anything between a year and 2 years, which is an awful long time by Western standards. And I still do this today. The last house I built, the cricket club cafe, it's just been nominated for a Jeffrey Bawa Award.
Right.
And I'm the only I think I'm the second non-architect in the history of the award who's been, I don't have a cat's chance in hell of winning, but it's lovely to be up there with all these actual proper, really great architects. So it's kind of nice. And having finished this book, I've just started restoring our old ancestral house in Kandy, which appears in the Ceaseless Chatter of Demons. So when you're next
Yes,
year,
I was just thinking about it.
to visit it, but it's an actual nightmare because it is an existing old house. What do you do when your ancestor has got the columns wrong? He's got the proportions wrong. I know it. I can look at it and say, whoever built this, they're meant to be Grecian columns, and the proportions are wrong. Do I change it? Or do I respect the wishes of the old house? So what I've done is I've kept the north front, the palace front, identical as was, and the convent front, which is on the other side, I've changed it somewhat to my way of thinking, and yet not enough that an outsider will see. So it's a really tricky thing. Restoration is quite different from building from scratch, as you know. So that's my project at the moment.
So I think, Ashok, it's time to open the floor for questions now. So let me just see what the questions are. Okay, there are messages for you. Ashok, that brilliant passage you read seems to parallel Sri Lanka's own tortured history and coming of age from the JVP uprising through the Elam Wars. Or am I reading too much into your words? The grief of the father dying and the
No, not at all. I think you're spot on, because we are tortured people. That seems to be our trademark here, you know. And I keep coming back to this time and time again. In the last book, I use as a joke that Anglican hymn, which says, "In Ceylon's fair isle, only man is vile." We are our own worst enemies. And I think that's because we are such complex people. I always say that India, which is such a humongous, it's a continent, it's not a country. It's an absolute continent. And yet, an Indian from the Northeast and an Indian from the Southwest have many more commonalities than a Sri Lankan living on the next road to me. Do you know? It's so layered, our society here. And that is echoed, I think, in that book. And this kind of the fractured and the rebuilding piece by piece, Humpty Dumpty, you know, you build Humpty Dumpty back up from scratch, if only waiting for it to fall back off the wall again. So well done you for spotting that.
Second question. Good evening, Mr. Ferrey. You're a writer, a builder, a personal trainer, and many other things. How do you balance these multiple identities?
Well, the sad answer is, as I get older, with more and more difficulty do I balance it. You know, when I was even sort of 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I could manage it all really easily because that it's all compartmentalized. One of the tricks is never let one layer mix with another. So, for instance, the other day I had to appear in a Sunsilk ad of all things. And it took virtually the whole day, and I got paid an absolute pittance. But you know, it's kind of nice to do it because you're in a different milieu. You're meeting these actors who you would never in 1,000 years meet. It's great material for some future book. So there am I sitting there, and my own book launches the next day. And I'm there at sort of 3 a.m. shooting this damn ad, the 89th take or whatever. But I know that that's another layer of life that I wouldn't normally be privy to. So to get back to your question, you have all these layers, and one of the ways of juggling them, juggling is the wrong word, of keeping them all afloat, is not to let them mix too much. Sadly, as you get older, people realize, you're a builder or whatever. But for years, I was able successfully to keep the layers separate and keep them each fulfilled, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's a trick, to keep them fulfilled so that they don't percolate into the other. Because if they do, then it becomes it's an unholy mess, really. When
it's an unholy mess,
mix
and it is all too easy for you to say, it is all too easy for you to take refuge in another discipline. If you build a bum house, it's all too easy to say, oh, but it doesn't matter really, I'm a writer and I can write better novels than I can build houses. No, wrong. In each discipline, you have to do the best you can in each discipline. And if you build a bum house, it is your poor skill, and you can't say it's luck, it's just bad judgment, and you got to take the rap for it.
This is a question from Aruna Pandey. Does the occult have to be sidelined in contemporary writing?
In the what writing? In the
contemporary writing?
Yeah. No, it doesn't have to be sidelined at all. I wanted it there. I wanted it off stage, though. One of the things I always get accused of is that I don't make things obvious, that they're too light and they're off stage. It's like a Greek tragedy where the murder is always off stage. Maybe it's having grown up in England and the English are past masters at understatement. Maybe that's what it is. I would always prefer to understate rather than overstate. And the occult is there. In fact, indeed, the whole book, as I said, is about this unreadable sky, which is the positive side of the occult, if you like. It's that force up there that we're trying to understand, and we never will in 1,000 years, try as we might. And yet we have to be aware of it, aware that there is this unseen force. At one point, Sanjay says, right at the end, he says, one thing that became clear, he's just been to see his mother, and he's aghast that his mother is still alive. He's standing outside in the on the winter gravel, waiting for the cab to take him back to the station. And he says, one thing was clear, that all these events in my life led me to this point. And perhaps my job in life was to give in to this divine, I hesitate to call it a divine plan, to this other plan with as good grace as I can muster. So, and that kind of embodies my own philosophy in life. You allow fate to buffet you to a certain extent. You don't say, I am not going in that direction. You keep yourself open, and you will have to be aware that there may be some plan there that it is your duty to fulfill, just being at this right place at the right time. So the occult is there. I don't make a big thing about it, because if I did, it would be kind of stating the obvious. These things have to be there. They have to be somewhat unreadable in the back, on the horizon. And they are for you to discover, you as the reader to discover. And it's the same with your own life. If somebody tells you the obvious, it is too obvious, you will never take it on board. Whereas if you discover it yourself, you will take it on. And Anita, this as a writer, that you got to take the reader up to a certain point, but he's got to make the jump on his own. So,
yeah, so there's a question here about a reader, and this is by Rimika Singhvi, who says, lovely listening to you both. Was wondering, Ashok, as to how much of the reader and what kind do you have in mind when you write?
Absolutely nothing. It is so treacherous to have a reader in mind, because essentially the reader you are writing for is yourself, has to be yourself, nobody else. Try and block everyone else out of your mind. One of the things we South Asians suffer from is that we have an excess of aunties and uncles and relations and people breathing down our neck. And that's what makes us so self-conscious in our writing. You have to get rid of that and write just for yourself.
Okay. So here's a question from K. Murthy at middlebury.edu. The unreadable sky, you like this phrase a lot and it's profound. why didn't you think of using it in the title of your book and call it The Unreadable Man? I don't quite understand the ramifications of the adjective unmarriageable.
Okay, and we did deal with this earlier. It was my original title, The Unreadable Sky. I was outvoted by my kids principally at the lunch
So he
table.
says you should call it The Unreadable Man. Because
no.
How does unmarriageable work as an adjective in this case?
I think The Unmanageable Man gives a slightly humorous twist to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it works very well with Sri Lankan readers who would look at the title, The Unreadable Sky, and not buy the book, I think. They would think, oh my God, this is some heavy new age bullshit, and throw the book away. Whereas The Unmanageable Man sounds kind of interesting. I mean, last night I had all these elderly Sri Lanka UK audience who were saying, The Unmanageable Man, it has to be about you, or it's about my husband, one woman said. Then another woman came to me and said, The Unmanageable Man, that's my husband, she said, you know. So it causes debate. So it's a much funnier title, true. I think.
Yeah, that's true. Let me see if there are any more questions. Okay. This is from Lata Katku, who says, very enjoyable and special. I think this is just a comment. I like the comparison between building a house and writing. We've enjoyed, and somebody else says, we've enjoyed one trip to Sri Lanka where we did visit a number of architectural beauties with a knowledgeable guide. It was such a learning and amazing experience. And someone says, yes, this is the person who asked you about the Unreadable Man, says, yes, Marriageable Man is indeed, says, thank you, Ashok, for your response. And someone else says, yes, Marriageable Man is indeed an interesting title. So
yes, it's a punchier title anyway.
Yeah,
and in some ways, it's a disingenuous title because it's not, strictly speaking, I mean, I refer to the unmanageable, I refer to my father, the father in the book rather, as the unmanageable man. But everybody will assume it's me or it's the protagonist in the novel, whereas in fact it's not. It's Having said that, I don't know, perhaps you could think of the protagonist as being unmanageable, because I won't spoil the story if I say anything more on that. I shouldn't.
And before we wind up, the one thing that I really would like to tell you is how much I love that character, Mickey. the way he falls. I mean, he says, like, he wakes up in the morning, he falls on his face, he wakes up in the morning and goes away without, ever anybody seeing the brunt of what his night was like. And he adds a really lovely, light and yet sad touch to.
And he is absolutely from life. His name was Michael Mulhern, and I employed him as a minder, because many of those incidents on the building site actually happened to me. The house was broken into once. They stole the ladder and the thief was down in the basement with the pickaxe. And if I'd gone down there, I would be dead. And then another time, the live cable and me sort of getting the shock of my life, literally, from a live cable in the basement. So all those things are true. Anyway, there were people breaking into the house and I would hear voices at night, and Michael was there. So ostensibly to protect me, but actually at the end of it, I was protecting him, I think, because he was so drunk, he was actually useless to anyone or anything. But all those things are taken absolutely from life. And in a way, this is kind of in honor of Michael, because Michael did die. And those are absolutely true, that he was discovered dead in his flat, though, not in my house. And the gas stove was still on and the frying pan was on with the bacon in it. So it's really, it's one of those cases where the truth was absolutely stranger than fiction. But thank you for liking Michael, because he is one of my favorite characters too.
So thank you, Ashok. It's been wonderful talking to you about The Unmarriageable Man, and all the very best. And I hope this book sells millions of copies for you.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, and thank you for such a perceptive set of questions. And thank you, readers, and thank you, viewers, also. It's been an absolute delight.
Just before we let you go, Ashok, there's just one more question that's come in right now. This is from Sunita Pansa. When you start writing, do you have a global audience in mind or just Sri Lanka?
Sorry, do you have, when you start writing, do you
have a global audience in mind or just Sri Lanka?
No. I think that was one of the mistakes I made early on. I imagined that I would have 200 readers and that was it. And they'd be all somewhat elderly Sri Lankan aunties. So that first book kind of had Sri Lankan aunties in mind. However, I have realized that 2 years ago, I was on board a ship and a Vietnamese lady, a Vietnamese millionaire, came up to me and said, you have described perfectly the life we lead in Ho Chi Minh City. So then I realized that actually, humanity is pretty much the same the world over. We may dress differently and so on, but actually, ultimately, we're all just as good or as bad as everyone else. So it is a global audience. However, do not have anyone in mind. I have to keep repeating this. If you're a writer, do not think of anyone. You have to lose your self-consciousness. Write for yourself. Write in an empty room. Write to the unreadable sky, please, to nothing else. Yeah.
On that note, I think it's the perfect note to end this session. Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, Anita. That was a wonderful conversation. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we really, really enjoyed it. Before I let everyone go, I'd also like to thank our partners, the Prabhakatan Foundation and Sri Simran.
Yes.
And Siahi, of course, is always happy to bring these sessions to you. Until next time, when we come back with another session, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you indeed. Thanks, Anita. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ashok.